Welcome to RTO Doctor's 6th podcast. My name is Lauren Hollis. I'm one of the directors of RTO Doctor, and today we are going to be covering Streamlined training packages. And as many of you would have been following us on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter, you would know that over the last week we've had some huge changes come out in the VET sector, and so we're going to be covering a little bit of that today as well. So let's get right into it. Okay, so today, as I said, what we're going to be covering is Streamlined training packages. And many of you might not even have heard of this term before. Some of you might have heard it, but your training package hasn't actually been affected yet. And some of you would already be starting to be familiar with it. The first Streamlined training package came out in October last year, and that was both the health and the community services training packages. There was only a few qualifications that were actually affected, and a few have been rolling out ever since that point. So what are Streamlined training packages? Well, this is just one of the many broad measures which was brought in by the government. It was agreed to in late 2012 and started to be implemented as of around mid-2013. Some of the reasons why this was brought in was actually in a response to partially just the size that the training packages had actually blown out to. For those of you that are involved in doing your mapping on a day-to-day basis, you would know that the amount of information that is now being audited as part of units has grown quite extensively, to the point where in some units you were having to do anywhere upwards of maybe 18 pages of mapping in order to make sure that all of the components were included in the unit. This is particularly true of units like the white card, where there's extensive range statements which have to be mapped into the unit criteria as well. So that was the first thing that this aimed to deal with. It was actually just to really pare back the content that was in those units and start focusing more on the real criteria, the really key skills, the really key knowledge that students needed to be able to be assessed on in order to be competent in that area. The second part of it was actually to make them more readable and accessible and reflective of what industry was. Now, for many of you that have been in the industry for more than a couple of years, you would know this is not the first time that they've made moves like this. Unfortunately, to be perfectly honest, it's not the first time they've failed in putting together units and policies like this. So in regards to whether or not this process has actually worked, there are definitely varying degrees of quality and success that have happened, and we're going to be talking about some of those issues later on today. But the first part that we actually wanted to talk to you about was what's actually involved in Streamlined training packages. So how do they actually break down, and how are they different from the units that you guys have already been dealing with and the structures that you've been dealing with? So as many of you would know, you've got several kind of key elements which form units of competency, and those key elements would be your performance criteria and your elements, your required skills, your required knowledge. Then you've got things like your critical aspects of assessment, your methods of assessment, your context and resources for assessment, and then you've got your range statements. Now, as we've discussed in previous podcasts, and if you guys are feeling a little bit unsure at this point, I would encourage you to go back and look at the assessment mapping podcast, because we cover this in a little bit more detail. But we talk a lot more about the amount of stuff that happens within each of those units. So that's the things that are covered now. The aim of the new training packages is really to kind of pare that down. So what we're seeing in the new training packages that are coming out, the new Streamlined training packages, you still have your performance criteria and your elements, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. The introduction of the foundation skills, so that's the key kind of skills that are required, so whether or not reading, writing, a specific level of communication is required in order to be able to be competent in the units. You've also got your performance evidence and your your knowledge evidence. Okay, now this is where we start to differ. So where you might have had one unit of competency before, what we've actually got now is we've got two separate guidelines. Okay, and this is where one of the first differences has come into place. So in the first, I guess, document that you would be downloading, what you'll have is you'll have your performance criteria and your elements, and then you'll have your foundation skills. Under the training package standards, under the standards for how the training packages were supposed to be developed. This is where it was supposed to be using industry language, okay? It was designed for industry to understand what they needed to see in their students, okay? What the outcomes were supposed to be for those students. And look, to be honest, the majority of training packages that have come out so far have copied and pasted them from previous training packages. There's been very little, almost no difference. And in this aspect, I have to say it has really failed to meet what it was supposed to be. As many of you would know, when you go out and you talk to industry and you show them the language from the performance criteria, they don't understand it. They find it very difficult to wrap their heads around what it is they're supposed to be seeing. And because many units, particularly generic units, aren't contextualized, it's not in a language that they can understand. So this is definitely something that the government's actually talking about now. It's something that's been brought up with the VET reform task, and for those of you who aren't familiar with VET reform task, I encourage you to Google it, go and follow us on LinkedIn, and that will take you through to all of the government links. So that's the process that's being undertaken at the moment. The second part is definitely where people have, the ISCs have done it a lot better. So in the second part, what you're actually going to get is the assessment requirements. Now this was the section that was designed for regulators. It was designed for trainers and assessors, and it was supposed to very clearly identify what skills you had to see them perform. Okay, that was your performance evidence, what knowledge you have to see them demonstrate, and the conditions under which that needs to happen. Okay, this is also where the implementation of the training packages varies quite a bit, and where some new issues are now arising now that people are starting to train these packages out. So just as an example of that, in the brand new first aid unit, which many people will eventually have to start to use, there is an assessment requirement that the assessor, specifically the assessor, has been working in industry in a couple of specific roles, such as an emergency officer, for a minimum of 3 years. Okay, in addition to having their TAA, having the required mapping and things like that. In some of the RII units, so that for those of you that don't know, that's in the resources training package, so that covers mining and civil construction. That's become incredibly problematic because some of the units require anywhere from 5 to 7 years experience in that specific field. So what you've got is you've got assessors have to have very specific requirements. They have to have quite extensive requirements of working within that sector. And then in addition to having those extensive requirements, in order to meet the NSSC requirements, they have to be able to demonstrate currency as well. So one of the issues that they're facing at the moment is that it's becoming a little bit more difficult to be able to find trainers and assessors who are going to be able to train in a range of different units. So what we will probably start seeing is that you'll start seeing assessors working more broadly across a few RTOs, specialising in their areas rather than working in one RTO and covering perhaps a range of related fields. So that's definitely a challenge that is being faced at the moment. The other addition in the assessor requirements is the change in what you can and can't assess under what are called simulated conditions. Now previously, under any of the other training packages, for the vast majority of units, it pretty much says that you can train this in a simulated environment or you can train it in the workplace. There is only a few training packages which very specifically said you had to train it in a workplace. You had no option but training it in a workplace. There was a few childcare units, for example, which had this mandatory requirement. We're going to see that being expanded quite significantly in regards to what you can and can't train in a simulated scenario. The move that's being made at the moment is generally that what they're looking for is the only time that you're going to be training in a simulated context is when there are safety issues by not training it in a simulated context. So for example, again, if we look back to first aid, quite reasonably so, you can't break somebody's arm and then ask a student to fix it. So what we're going to be looking for there is that obviously there's no other circumstance available but to simulate that circumstance. But for example, the control BAT traffic unit in RII, that's also used throughout quite a lot of other units, you know, within construction and things like that. That is no longer allowed under simulated conditions. Okay, the white card unit have just come out, and the WA government, for example, has specified that that will no longer be acceptable to be studied solely under online training. You have to have a practical component, a face-to-face component for that. So those sorts of assessment conditions are being much more closely regulated now. Now, anything within those assessment conditions will be regulated by ASQA. They have been very clear about that. Those are written for the regulators, they are written for the RTOs, and that is what you are going to be assessed against. Okay, any of those endorsed components will be assessed by ASQA. Now, there's also what are called companion guides, which come along with those. These are very, very clearly stated that these are kind of additional guidance. It provides some additional context for those units that might be a little bit more generic. Those are outside of the requirements, okay? They are not NSSC endorsed components, and therefore they are not to be audited, okay? They do not need to go into your mapping guides. They are not to be audited by ASQA or any of the other regulatory bodies. Okay, so that kind of starts to cover where we're dealing with Streamline training packages, and I've started to touch on some of the issues that you're going to be facing. When you're looking at actually starting to put together assessments for this, there are a couple of other points that I want you guys to be aware of, and that's because this has come up from areas where despite going through a quality assurance process, there's some differences between what the training package requires, okay, and then still continuing to meet your rules of evidence. Alright, so I'll give you an example of that in several of the units that come out within the community services training package. It will state very clearly that within the unit of competency, within the assessment requirements, you have to observe tasks A, B and C once. Okay, so if you create a practical assessment, for example, that allows you to observe each of those, you know, scenarios, for lack of a better word, once, you would be meeting the unit criteria requirements. However, when your auditor comes in, okay, and they start looking at the evidence that you are going to compile for the student against that specific criteria, the auditor will be looking for 2. Okay, the reason why the auditor will be looking for 2 is to meet the rules of evidence for sufficiency, which says that your assessment has to be collected over a period of time. There are no auditors that I'm aware of that consider once to be a period of time. It also requires you to do it as a process, and again, there are no auditors that I'm aware of that say once is sufficient for a process. So just be a little bit aware that while you are writing to meet the unit requirements, that the VQF, okay, the principles of assessment and the rules of evidence will still apply to all of that. You'll still be audited against all of that, so you need to make sure that you're still covering your bases for all of those. Okay, so when are these actually going to be rolled out? Now, the original agreement was basically that up until December 31st, 2013, the training packages could still be endorsed in the old format. From the 1st of January 2014, okay, all of the training packages, all of the updates were to be in the new standards, okay. The issue that we've had with that is that the NSSC is gone. As of the 28th of February this year, as many of you would have known, the NSSC put out a formal announcement saying we've put on hold the processing of all training packages pending further information. On a meeting that happened on April 3rd with the new COAG, the SCOTIS, which, if I can just explain this, you've got SCOTIS, which sits here. Underneath SCOTIS, you've got the NSSC, who is responsible for approving all of the training packages. SCOTIS got replaced by the COAG Industry Skills Council, that's CISC, and if you go onto the old SCOTIS website, which is SCOTESE, you'll be able to find out some more information about that, or you can follow us on RTO Doctor. As of 2 days ago, they made the formal announcement that the NSSC has been disbanded, okay, and that is going to be replaced by what is called an industry-focused council. Okay, they haven't actually said what that's going to be at the moment. Our understanding in speaking with the Minister's office is that there's been a proposal put forward of what that council should look like. That's gone out to the states for consultation. The states are going to have a couple of weeks to mull that over, and then the new council will start to be implemented. Okay, the new council is supposed to be more responsive to industry. How that's going to work, how that's going to look, is still being very much kept behind closed doors until the states have had a chance to comment on it. Again, in our understanding with conversations with the Minister's office and with articles that you may have seen coming out from the Australian, it is supposed to be more responsive to industry needs. It's actually supposed to have electives from industry and electives from the VET industry, which will be sitting on that council. And supposedly those members will be elected by the CISC, the COAG Industry Skills Council, which is the new council which has been appointed. The other councils which sit around that purpose, so you've got your quality assurance panel, that's sat under the NSSC, so understanding is that that will go and a new QA process will be brought in. The NVEAC will also go partly. This is all kind of in response to the whole government's reductions of red tape to meet that $1 billion a year initiative. So it's very much in a kind of state of flux at the moment, as is per usual for the VET industry. What we are recommending to everybody at the moment is that if you are considering an addition to scope, okay, it's really important that you find out where the development of your training package is, so that you can make a decision as to whether or not you're going to bother going through the process of developing all those materials. A good example of that is there are about 8 or 9 training packages that have got a range of their qualifications sitting in, waiting for whatever the new body is that the NSSC is going to be, to put in those changes. So for example, the TAE is one of those training packages. Okay. So as usual, everything is in a state of flux with the VET industry. What we are recommending to people is that if you're considering an addition to scope, it's really important to find out where your training packages are sitting at the moment. There's a couple of training packages which have already been through their review processes, and they actually had those new versions waiting and sitting with the NSSC prior to all this happening. If you are having one of those training packages, and the TAE would be a good example of that, you need to be making a very conscious decision for your business as to whether or not it's going to be a viable process for you to go through creating all of that, all of those resources and all of those assessments, and paying for the cost of the addition to scope. The reason why we say that is if, for example, this process gets back up and running within the next month, and our understanding is that that is the Minister's office goal, is that within kind of the next 6 weeks, the new body will be approved and things will start to get rolling again. Let's say you spend the time, you spend $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 developing all your resources with your trainers. You then pay all of the ASQA fees to have those additions to scope put in place. 4 days before your site audit, the training package rolls, okay? ASQA will not, okay, I repeat, they will not approve you for a superseded qualification, okay? It means that all that money, all that time, all that effort will have been wasted, okay? They have an absolute zero tolerance on this policy. They will not approve superseded qualifications for addition to scope, okay? Regardless of the fact that it's, you know, that if you've already got it on scope, you've got that 12-month teach-out period, the transition period does not apply if you're working in an addition to scope. If you do need to find out where the training package is sitting, if you are considering an addition to scope, all of the industry skills councils do have on their website what their continuous improvement plan is. Some of the most recent changes have thrown that in a little bit into flux, but what you can do is you can contact your Industry Skills Council, ask for the representative of your training package and find out where your qualification is sitting, and they'll be able to give you a fairly good indication as to whether or not it's 6 months away, if it's sitting with the council, that sort of a process. So if you're thinking about starting looking at addition to scope today, if your training package is looking at the within 6 months updating to the Streamline version, we would strongly be considering that you need to decide how important it is to your business before you go through that process. If it is important to your business and it's going to come close to that crossover time, then you may need to consider getting both options ready. Because that being said, if your audit happens 4 days after it's rolled and you've got all of the new materials ready to go, they will look at allowing you to update your addition to scope and audit you against the new materials. So that's really key. If you've got any questions about that process, as you all know, please feel free to give us a call. You can email at lauren@rtodoctor.com.au. You can give us a call on 0433 185 741, or you can tweet me or LinkedIn me or whatever it is that you guys, however it is that you guys want to connect with us, please feel free to do that. There are no stupid questions. If you're a new trainer and you're watching this and you're sitting there feeling even more confused about what it is that you need to do within VET, I encourage you to go on to LinkedIn and connect to a couple of different groups. There's the VET Reform Task Force group, which talks very much with some really experienced professionals about what's happening in the industry at the moment and the consultations that are taking place. There's a great group called the TAE Newcomers Group, where myself and a few other experienced professionals are happy to answer all of your stupid questions. There is no such thing as a stupid question, but we're happy to answer whatever question you have about VET. And there's a range of other really fantastic groups on there as well. There's groups for trainers with really fantastic and new ideas and approaches at looking at things. So make sure that you go and jump on that website and start your PD today. Thank you very much for your time. As usual, if you want any more information, go to www.rtodoctor.com.au or email me at lauren@rtodoctor.com.au. Have a great day, and I will see you in 2 weeks.